Okay, what we'll do this. We've got a number of people coming on, and what I'll do is, as they come on, they'll just come on as is. We'll just jump into this. And again, it is altogether appropriate, if not ironic, that I'm hosting a luncheon society dealing with the growth of the international economy from my hotel room in Copenhagen. But here we are. But what makes this interesting is this: what Jeff Garten does, and this is really good, he brings to life something that is kind of, which is often seen as dry. He brought international monetary policy to life based on the people who were involved in the events that took place. And after World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement, you had this approach to the rebuilding of Europe and Asia, and then there came a time when that no longer worked. And so we found ourselves in a situation where American gold reserves were in fact being depleted. You had a variety of European nations who wanted to be paid gold on demand, and this all came to a boiling point. And so in August of 1971, a secret meeting was called. Nobody knew what the agenda was, perhaps for President Nixon, maybe a few others. And then it's fair to say that there was the equivalent of an XCOM, I'll use a Cuban Missile Crisis equivalent. And then, what happened is that Richard Nixon gathered a unique group of political figures and policy wonks, and together they all walked into a brave new world where we are today. And with that, what we're going to do is we'll have Jeffrey talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, and it's all Q&A after that. So what we do is, so that we're not talking over each other, go to the chat comment, put your name in the chat box, and then that's how we'll do that. And more folks are coming on, so this will be great. All right, Jeffrey, take it away.
Well, first, Bob, thanks very much. When you contacted me, I had no idea of what the luncheon group was, but you sent me I think a invitation list of a past event, and I found it so interesting and so eclectic. And I said to myself, I don't ever remember having lunch with a group of people like that. And so I was very anxious to take you up on your invitation. And I just want to say that there are some people on this call, like Barry Eichengreen, who have forgotten more about what I wrote about than I ever learned. So I'm looking forward to a real discussion here. I'll just summarize very quickly what I tried to do. Someone said that this was the most important meeting that no one ever heard of. And I had vaguely heard of it. I couldn't have told you more than a minute about what happened there. And so I started to do some reading and some research. And I thought that I had identified a really pivotal moment in the post-World War II history of the US and the international financial system. And as Bob said, what really happened, I mean, in order to understand this story, you have to go back to 1944, when the Allies at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, designed a global monetary system for the post-World War II era. And at the heart of this was the notion of an open world economy, open especially to trade, not necessarily to capital, but to expanding trade. And at the heart of that was what became the dollar gold standard, that for $35 you could buy 1 ounce of gold, and every currency was fixed to the dollar. And this was supposed to provide the kind of stability and predictability that would give global commerce a real boost. And it wasn't the only major feature, but it was a key feature. And I think you can correlate it with what was a spectacular period of economic progress in the 50s and the 60s. Progress which saw the phenomenal recovery of Japan and Western Europe, and progress which brought really
The lenses are no good when I want to come in.
Hold on a second.
Progress which came to the US in the form of prosperity that was very equitable, that was really middle-class prosperity. But the seeds of the system had in it its own destruction, because the dollar, being the world's principal currency, eventually inundated the world. And there were a huge number of dollars. And when the US started to mismanage its economy in the late 60s, early 70s, when we started to have inflation, the purchasing power of the dollar really began to decline. So countries outside the US who were holding dollars that were theoretically convertible to gold began to realize that we didn't have enough gold to back all those dollars. In fact, when the whole system started, we had almost 160% coverage of gold to dollars. But by 1971, we were down to only 25%. So the emperor had no clothes, and Nixon and his top advisors were forced to reckon with this. And that's when they went to Camp David, just about 50 years ago, in the middle of next month, and they made a series of decisions, one of which was to de-link the dollar from gold. And I can say that sort of dispassionately or analytically, but psychologically, that was a huge move, because that was the system that everybody knew. And while I think the financial officials in countries like West Germany and England understood that the game had to change, that the dollar gold standard was no longer viable, just the notion of making that decision and announcing it to the world and kind of jumping off a cliff, because without that link, it wasn't clear what kind of monetary system would eventually evolve. That was a really big deal. And I think that there are several links between those decisions and today. And I'll just mention one of them, and we can come back later to the others. But for thousands of years, currency was often backed by some kind of tangible metal. And when we said the dollar was no longer convertible into gold, it really raised some fundamental questions about what is the value of currencies, and especially if they start to fluctuate against one another, how do we define value? And I would say that the system that evolved from this meeting, which was floating exchange rates, not right away, but a couple of years later, that's the system that we have today. And this issue of what is value, what do you trust to be value, I think can be related also today to the evolution of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. And so we're entering a kind of a brave new world, very controversial, a lot of different opinions about it. But I kind of draw a line between the end of the post-World War II monetary system in August 1971 to a lot of the issues that we are wrestling with today and will wrestle even more intensely with in the years ahead. So let me stop there. There's a lot else, obviously, to discuss, but that's kind of the outlines of the book.
Well, I'll start off with the first question, and just all you need to know, all you need to do to ask a question is just throw your name into the chat box, and I'll manage that. Walk us through the personality of Richard Nixon, especially the secretive nature of Nixon at that point, in terms of how he was and how that affected folks going into that weekend, and how he was able to come away with a decision. Was it one of those things where Nixon knew where he wanted the consensus to go, Or was it one of those things where the discussions between the principals, and those essentially were people who were, towering giants of economics and politics, did he derive the consensus out of that?
Well, that's a great question. And let me say, I think I've written the only book about this meeting, the only full-length book. There's been some academic treatments with PhDs, and there's been a lot of really important analytical work. But where I tried to differentiate the story, Bob, as you're intimating, is I try to make it character-driven. So I went into great length, not about Nixon and about the people around him. And I found that kind of fascinating, actually, because I started out with a sense that these were some smart, experienced people that made a shoot from the hip decision, and that it was highly political. And basically, my overall view should be to be critical. I ended up in a much different place. And so let me just say a few words about Nixon, and then we can talk about some of the other characters. But I don't think Nixon had any interest at all in the international monetary system as such. I mean, and let me just say, I tried very, very hard to look at Nixon pre-Watergate. I tried not to be influenced by what I knew and what we all knew happened afterwards. So I was trying to take a very honest view, straight on, as to what was this guy thinking in 1971. And actually, he had a very sophisticated grasp of the international system and foreign policy. And what he knew was that during the 60s and early 70s, there had been a series of monetary crises based on the fear abroad that the US dollar would be devalued against gold. And these were causing real foreign policy concerns among the key allies, particularly West Germany and Japan. And what was most on Nixon's mind was that he wanted to be the fellow who opened China, and he wanted to be the person who initiated arms control agreements with the Soviets. And he did not want the Allies sniping at his heels on a whole bunch of other issues. And so what was in his mind was, how do we quell this? How do we get some calm in the global monetary system? That was one. Second, he was a domestic politician, and he was dealt a hand of growing inflation and also increasing unemployment. And he made a very clear decision that he was going to let inflation go, but he was going to deal with unemployment because he thought that was a much more potent political issue in terms of his ultimate reelection. And as a result, inflation didn't get the treatment it wanted, and the US economy growth was slowing, inflation was increasing. And he needed a grand gesture to kind of deal with this. And so he was convinced, principally by John Connally, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, someone who would have been very much at home in the Trump administration, an ardent nationalist, someone whose motto basically was, let's screw the foreigners before they screw us. And he basically convinced Nixon that he could do something that everybody would applaud at home, ensure his reelection, and also deal with the international aspects of his currency crises. So Nixon was persuaded in large part by Connally, and he was surrounded by people who didn't have the same view, but who ultimately went along, and then with the assistance of Henry Kissinger, quelled the foreign policy fallout. So I gave Nixon pretty high marks because he balanced a lot of things. And in the end, he didn't upset the alliance, the political alliance, military alliance, and he got the US to a better place when it came to its currency. So I think that I give him high marks. I mean, I know all the warts, and I know that there are a lot of people who say he should have gone after inflation sooner, and there are a lot of people who say he did all this in order to be reelected. But you know, you got to filter this stuff through. I mean, he was a politician, and I defy you to point to a successful one that wasn't obsessed with their reelection and took some shortcuts to do that.
Tim Farley, you're next, and Tom Kosh after that. Tim, you're up.
Thank you so much. And it really is an honor to chat with you on a topic. My question really is a modest statement, and that's what they say. I was 11 years old in August of 1971, and I will tell you that became dinner table conversation at my home, a refinery town 30 miles east of San Francisco. It was whatever you were talking about, it was a big deal. It's the first time I ever heard the expression, the gold standard. It was the first time I ever heard of stuff like monetary policy, and my parents were trying to sort it out. My father was a retired GI, and my brother and I were born abroad, so they had a great deal of international concerns and so forth. So I just want to echo or confirm that at the time, it was a very big deal. And of course, Nixon had only won by 43% in 1968. He was afraid of his shadow. He was afraid of absolutely everything going into his election, as far as I can tell. I know there's a few folks with more gray hair than I am that remember those times. But I just wanted to say that in 1971, in my family, devaluing the dollar was a big deal. So it confirms what you were saying.
You know, let me make one other point, which I should have done at the beginning, that if you want to look at this, I think in the biggest frame, it was that the United States had to end what one of the participants at the meeting said was the Marshall Plan mentality. That we were dealt a hand after the Second World War that put enormous responsibility on American shoulders. And both Nixon and Kissinger came into public office with the determination to make a major adjustment in those burdens. Now, part of it was because of the Vietnam War, but part of it was also because of the economic responsibilities that we held. And when it came to the monetary system, although it never quite worked this way, foreign countries expected us to manage our economy in such a way that the dollar, being the global currency, would be very stable. And they had expectations that we would gear our fiscal and monetary policy for not only domestic purposes, but international purposes. But it was totally unrealistic because, you know, for example, they wanted us to give them trade concessions that were lopsided, that weren't reciprocal. And you know, in 1950, we could do that. In 1960, we could do that because we were so disproportionately strong. But an adjustment had to be made as Japan and Germany recovered from the war, became extremely competitive in manufactured goods. 1971, we had our first trade deficit since the late 1800s. Labor unions had turned protectionist, which was a big change for the US because for most of the post-war period, they were free traders. And so we were facing a need for a major adjustment, both in political and military terms, and also in economic terms. And so this meeting, to me, is a symbol for what was a major adjustment in the US position in the world. And I've taken a small part of that, you know, the monetary system, but it's only one part. of what was a massive change.
And with that, we go to Tom Kosh.
I have a brief anecdote and then a question for Jeffrey. Like Tim, this was a big issue growing up. We're all the same age. And I grew up in Nixon's home county. And like Bob, I was not exactly an valedictorian of my class. So the only scholarship I was able to secure for college was via a debate in Orange County, California, over the merit of the gold standard. And so I took the anti-position and was able to get a few bucks for a higher education. My question is, with the authority and the decoupling that your book is about, Jeffrey, and this is for yourself or perhaps anyone else in the group, bring it current day, we are now looking down the road in a couple months at yet another showdown over the debt limit. And back in toward the end of the Obama presidency, when the Republicans are taking control of both houses in his last 2 years, the concept came up that the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to coin platinum coins of any denomination, literally of any denomination, not unlike a $50 trillion bill. Do you have any thoughts about the idea that to take away the ability of the Republicans in the Congress to extort and or hold us hostage, if Secretary Yellen might avail herself of that, of creating a $5 trillion coin, putting in the Treasury, and therefore the debt limit is no longer relevant? It was discussed sort of tongue in cheek back then, but we may be facing it again.
I would put it in a slightly different context. I think to me, the big question is, why has the dollar stayed at the center of the global economy for so long? And especially after it wasn't backed by any kind of tangible product. And to me, the answer is one, no country has the kind of economy of the size and strength or has had that up until now. And secondly, no country wanted to have their currency as an international currency with all the ups and downs that entails. But mostly there was confidence in US institutions. There was confidence in an independent Fed. There was confidence in what I would call a competent SEC. We had the rule of law. No one was concerned that money coming into the US would be blocked. And that was saying a lot, that was saying a lot vis-a-vis other countries. But, and I'm getting this thing I'll come to the debt limit, that I think the biggest threat to the dollar is what we do to ourselves. And I think that, if we have a president who publicly berates the head of the Fed, if we have a president who tries to stack the board of the Fed, if we have a Congress that brings us right up to the brink of default because of the debt ceiling, that's when the dollar is really going to become much more of an ordinary currency. And that's when the challenge from the euro and the RMB and perhaps digital currencies will really take hold. So this is a really dangerous point. This is a particularly dangerous moment for the debt ceiling because there is so much doubt in the rest of the world about the credibility of our system, of our open democratic system. I don't think that Janet Yellen, she may have the ability to, mint that coin, but it would be seen, I think, as just evidence that all we have are tricks and gimmicks.
Right.
And it would be even if she could do it, it would be dangerous and much more dangerous today than it would have been 4 years ago or 8 years ago, because we are, in my view, the greatest threat to the dollar, greater than wars, greater than 2008 kinds of currency debacles is what happened on January 6th. And so we have to be really careful now. We're in a hole, I think, when it comes to how other countries see us, and rightfully so. I'd be really leery of any gimmicks.
If I may follow up just briefly on that, and I
Sure.
don't disagree with you. The right now, with the inflation we're seeing in the last few months, real returns on the long-term treasury note are at what, -3%, -4%, thereabouts. I mean, how long can that last and still have the dollar seen as the world's reserve currency?
Well, it's all relative, right? I mean, the European rates are very low, and Chinese system is very closed. So I think that when talking about the strength of the dollar or the centrality of the dollar, we've got to look at what else is out there, because there aren't too many markets that can absorb the capital that we can. And even in our debilitated state, we have open, flexible capital market, deep capital markets that are very hard to match. So I'm not so worried about the interest rates, since it's a kind of a global condition anyway. And I myself would not correlate that to the viability of the dollar.
Thank you.
And with that, Ambassador Schwab, you're up.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. As you know, Jeffrey, I thought the book was terrific, and the individuals who participated in that meeting that weekend were really a group of remarkable individuals. The picture on the cover of the book, other than, as you and I have laughed, being all white men, older white men,
Right.
George Shultz and Paul Volcker and Pete Peterson and Ken Dam, and just some really remarkable individuals. I would ask sort of two questions. One, if we were to find ourselves with a leader who wanted to make a fundamental change and or on the verge of a crisis, could you see that kind of dynamic playing out today? And then second, what you alluded to earlier, a lot of the issues that were coming into play at that point in time really are coming into play now, although it's with other types of currencies, right? What is the value of a cryptocurrency? What is the value of a currency that is controlled, like the renminbi, that's controlled by a government, but of the largest economy in the world? And so I'd like you to just project out a little bit the lessons learned from that weekend that we might think about today.
Great question. And let me just say, I've known Susan for a long time. I'm not even going back how long, but
1993, I think, when you were going into the Commerce Department, I believe.
But I certainly had heard of you long before that. And Susan read my one of the early manuscripts and really helped me a lot. So I'm really grateful for that. Well, let me just say that I think there are there's some parallels and some real differences between then and now in terms of America's ability to act on the global stage. I think it would be very possible, I'd like to think it was very possible, for a president to surround himself or herself with really top people, a number of whom we may not even have heard of, in the way that, in 1971, nobody knew who Paul Volcker was outside a very small group of people. And George Shultz was even less known. He had basically just come he was a labor negotiator who was the dean of the business school at Chicago. Or Pete Peterson. I mean, these were guys who were surrounding Nixon, who had been the president of Bell and Howell, but never spent a day in public policy. And yet these men together, I think, provided a very wide range of views to Nixon. He forged a policy out of that. But he was at least exposed to a lot of alternatives. And that was really important because ultimately some of those alternatives became policy. For example, during that weekend, they agreed that we would devalue the dollar, but then we would fix the dollar to other currencies. So we wanted a one-time realignment and then stable rates. Whereas George Shultz was saying, that is yesterday's system. We need to go, George Shultz coming from Chicago, free market person, anticipating that we would need to go to floating rates, and eventually we did. But he aired the idea. Or Paul Volcker saying, you can devalue the dollar and we have to do it, but we have to reform the monetary system. We have to give the IMF a bigger role. We have to do some other things. We just can't do this one thing. And eventually he prevailed. So I think that one thing we could do is to, as we look at the era ahead, and I do think we're coming to an end of an era here, and kind of like, just as we were getting out of Vietnam and we're getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq, there is sort of an economic component too. And I think we should have the intellectual firepower to come up with some really good ideas. And I would hope there would be a diversity of experience and talent, just as there was in '71. But here, there are two really big differences. That in 1971, even though we were attempting to spread the burdens of leadership, we had so much power that Nixon could basically unilaterally say, you're not getting the gold. We're going to a totally different system. And then it became the task to negotiate it, but nobody could really stand in our way. It's totally different now. The requirements now for multilateral diplomacy are really enormous. And the other big difference is that in 1971, the word globalization hadn't been invented. We were beginning to feel it. We were running a trade deficit. Labor was losing jobs, but only about 10% of our economy was wrapped up in the international sphere. Today, it's closer to 30. We are so enmeshed in the global economy that just the room for maneuver seems to me to be much less, and the need for multilateral diplomacy much more. So we could field a really good team, but that would be just the beginning. And I think the challenges ahead for us are actually much more complex than they were for Nixon. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but
That's fine.
No, thank you.
So next will be Fred Wistow and then Ben. And Fred had to take off, but so he gave me his question. He said, explain the relationship between John Connally and Richard Nixon. At the outset, it doesn't seem like it would make sense. Here was John Connally, who at that point was a protege of Lyndon Johnson. Yes, he came from the conservative side of Texas Democratic politics, but it didn't seem that he would be a potential natural heir for Richard Nixon, as he was trying to line Connally up for a potential 76 run until the milk scandal. Walk us through that relationship, because that seems to be the most curious in the entire book.
and it was a very tight relationship. I tell an anecdote in the book how Nixon met Connally, or how he saw him in action. And in 1969, I think it was, maybe early 70, Nixon had asked can't remember his first name. I think it was John Ash. Last name was Ash.
Yeah.
To head up a commission on how to reform the government. And it was a very high level commission. And at the very end, they were presenting their report. Conley happened to be a member of the commission. Nixon didn't know him. Conley had just come off being a two-term governor of Texas. And Ash was explaining the recommendations, and Nixon was falling asleep because the notion of reforming the civil service and this and that just bored him to death. And Conley saw that that his attention was dissipating. And so he stepped up and he said, here's the thing. And he described the notion of reform of the public sector in very sexy terms. And he said it really didn't matter whether they got this through the Congress or not. It was a big initiative, and it would translate in the public to a president that wanted efficiency. And he did it with a few words, and Nixon immediately recognized somebody who could cut through all the junk and see it in political terms. And so one thing that Nixon really appreciated about Conley was he was a politician like Nixon. He was a very skillful politician. As you said, he learned everything from Lyndon Johnson. Nixon had nobody in his cabinet who was a real politician. He had a lot of smart policy people, but he had nobody who basically was a ferocious political guy. And when he realized Conley's reason for being would be to get Nixon reelected, that was all he needed. And Conley was totally apolitical when it came to what goals he wanted. And he had this saying, I can play it straight, I can play it round, just tell me how to play it. Nixon told him he needed to be reelected. And Conley was the only person in that whole cabinet who basically could do that in a way that Nixon would really appreciate. So I think that was one. The other is that Nixon was facing a democratically controlled Congress. And in those days, the leading Democrats tended to be Southern Democrats, conservative Democrats. They had all the major committees. And Conley was just, he was the guy they would go to a bar with. He knew them all. They really respected him. They liked him. And so he was an absolutely essential link between Nixon and Congress.
Cool. And now it's Ben Bradley, you're up. You're on mute.
Got it. Jeffrey, I was struck by what you said earlier, that in your view, the greatest threat to the dollar is January 6th. I've been following that very closely, including watching the riveting testimony of the 4 police officers this morning. And in my view, it's by far the biggest problem we face as a country. It seems to me that we're almost on the verge of a civil war, not over slavery or secession, but over the truth today, and how it's come to pass that a renegade president has exerted the influence over 74 million people that he has over what's plainly a lie. But I always thought of it as a domestic issue over democracy and voting rights, but you're tying it now to international economy and the strength of the dollar. Could you elaborate a little on that? And is there a place for Janet Yellen to exert influence here?
Well, I'm relating it to the essence of America's political system. That what January 6th raises in my mind is the likelihood unless something changes, that every major election we have is going to be contested. And it's not going to be contested in some polite way. You know, that this is potentially going to tie up the country in the most sort of anti-democratic environment, or of a kind that we could never have envisioned before. Just wouldn't, they wouldn't, you know, if somebody wrote a novel about it, you would say it's ridiculous. And the reason it relates to the dollar is, I think that in a world of floating currencies, and in a world where, you know, there is a lot of resentment against the way we manage the dollar. We are prone, we, the US government, prone to slap around economic sanctions as though that is the first, second, and third, you know, resort of all our foreign policy. And we have imposed secondary sanctions, which are really pernicious for the people who are exposed to that. And so it's no secret that the Europeans and the Chinese, who on other levels may be very incompatible, the one thing they agree on is that the US monopoly on the functioning of the global financial system, precisely because it's dollar-based, that has to go. Now, they haven't figured out a way to do that, but the more our political system disintegrates, the more they are going to feel that they have to find another way. And here is the direct link, that if we can't have real elections, then no foreign country can depend on us for any consistency. Forget about the dollar. There would be no way for anyone to say President Biden's commitment to do this or that is going to hold, or whoever succeeds him. And I firmly believe that there is embedded in the preference for using the dollar, or the acceptance of the dollar as the world's major currency, a certain confidence in the United States. I mean, I'm not trying to paint too rosy a picture. We've done a lot of things that other countries resented. We've done a lot of things we've come to resent. But on, relatively speaking, there's good reason to have confidence in the US over a long period of time. But January 6th, to me, until that is resolved, basically says all bets are off.
How do you see it resolving itself?
I have no idea how it's going to happen. I have no idea. I mean,
Go ahead. Let me follow up on Ben's question a bit. Back in 1971, you had a variety of political protests. You had 500,000 people at the Pentagon. You had a very vibrant and vocal anti-war coalition, anti-war, anti-draft. In many respects, does what took place at that point parallel to what took place on January 6th, while very different in terms of aims and political bent, but nonetheless, did that at that time create questions in the minds of European and Asian political leaders about the long-term sustainability of the American economic system in the way that you talked about how January 6th might do the same? Or were they just so completely different, with the idea that the Vietnam War was in certain respects winding down, as opposed to and Ben, I'll give Ben a plug. Ben wrote a book called The Forgotten, which really focused on some of these Trump voters in one county, Luzerne County in Pennsylvania, and how it really flipped the state, which flipped the county, the state, and the election. Or are these people who are protesting and those who supported them something that'll be out, a long-term issue that American policymakers and with that economic policymakers have to contend with? That's a long-winded question, so good luck.
I think it's a great question. As someone who was graduated from college in 1968, I'm not unfamiliar I mean, it's been a long time, but I'm not unfamiliar with the degree of social unrest. And, stemming from the war, but also the racial problems and the urban problems. And certainly at the time, there was generations that were older than us, I think, had lots of concerns about the U.S., where the U.S. was headed. But as far as I know, the viability of our political system, of our democracy, was not called into question in anywhere near the same way that January 6th has done. And I think the proof really was that we could impeach a president, and the government could go on. That as deep as the crimes of Nixon was, it didn't come close to eroding all of our institutions. We're not, I mean, I guess everybody has their own view on this, but we're way past that. We're in much worse shape than in 68 or 70 or 71. So in a way, I think 71 would have, the 68, 70, 71 period, early 70s, is proof of the depth of our resilience, of our political resilience. But, I think people still believe then in a set of facts. And, science wasn't being challenged. Facts were
Yeah.
One of the things that Nixon had, this is quite interesting, is that the Democratic Congress, he managed to forge a consensus that there was a big center in that Congress. There were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Imagine this, Nixon is part of those, we haven't talked about this, but at the same time that he severed the link between the dollar and gold, he put on a wage and price freeze for the first time in American peacetime. Froze all wages and prices. Put a tariff on everything coming into the US. He got total applause from a Democratic Congress and a lot of support from the Republicans. So, there was, despite everything that was going on, there was a center. I don't think we have that now.
And with that, we'll go to Daniel Henderson and then Reverend Scott. Daniel, where are you? You're on mute, Daniel.
Mute.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. So in a world where fiat currency is predominant and where faith in currency is congruent to faith in the government that prints it, with everything that happened on January 6th, how close are we to that loss of trust territory, and sort of how thin is the ice? What would happen? What could happen to derail that? And if that were to happen, what would be the global consequences?
Well, I can't answer that definitively, but I would say that we're not far from the precipice. That if we find that the Biden administration can't pass anything, especially the things where there's a lot of public support, like the infrastructure. If we go too far with the debt ceiling, if the congressional midterms show a massive switch to a Trump-like Republican Congress, if the next election brings a president whose only purpose is to vitiate everything that the last one did, I don't know how that, to me, that's really bad. I mean, that's an understatement. And I can see how all that can happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think that political thrust would really pose a major problem for the viability of the dollar. In large part because all of that carries some policy implications. I mean, I can be very critical of the Biden administration, but the one thing I think that they're trying to do is to rebuild alliances and to try to, if not roll back protectionism, not increase it too much. But we could easily have a group that goes in a much different direction, more pernicious direction, in my terms. So you ask how close we are. I think the next few years are really key.
And with that, we'll go to Scotty McLennan.
Can I change the perspective for a moment to ask some questions about gold since 1971? That is the price of an ounce having gone from $35 to now about 1,800. The gold is an investment vehicle. Gold and its political implications, say with gold mining in South Africa, and the millennial-old repository of value that gold has been. What does all of this mean going back to 1971 for gold?
I'm not going to try to answer it because I just don't know. I think gold, as when it was backing a currency, it was the best that we could think of to do. But ultimately, it was very irrational. We were very dependent on how gold was mined. It turned out that South Africa and Soviet Union had a huge amount of the gold, and we were really boxed in because in delinking the dollar from gold, we left the Europeans and the Japanese high and dry because they were holding a lot of dollar reserves, thinking it was as good as gold. And since then, as you point out, gold has gone its own way. I mean, I think it's still not a bad inflation hedge if it's over a long period of time. But I would be very surprised if it ever enters the monetary realm again, unless there is some major meltdown and we're starting, if we're starting from scratch again, maybe there is something to the fact that gold has had this allure going back thousands of years, and we would, we'd look at it again. But for right now, to me, it's kind of an irrelevancy, but I'm not really the right one to ask.
And with that, we'll go to Sarah Tershwell. And who's on mute? Oh, she's still in. She is still. Well, and until when Sarah comes back, I'll ask a question. There was this political notion. Oh,
wait, Bob.
Go ahead.
No,
Sarah,
listen. Like I'm with a bunch of people. I can't talk. That's why I emailed you the question.
I will ask the question.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I'll ask Sarah's question. Hold on. I feel like every generation believes that we are in a worse situation than we were. I would like to know why the party in charge, the Democrats, are not doing more to reach across the aisle and start to rebuild fractured relationships by focusing on issues we can agree on. And if financial experts like Jeff are willing to push, and are financial experts like Jeff willing to push the Biden administration toward the goal? That's Sarah's question.
Trying to figure out what that question is. I think Sarah is asking, why doesn't the Biden administration do more to forge a bipartisan ties? Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. And I'll add a little more to that. During the late 60s, during the Johnson administration, there was a time when when Walter Cronkite came back from Vietnam, South Vietnam, and he said basically to the American people one evening, there's no way we can win. The best that we can hope for is a negotiated peace from a country that tried to do its best. And at that time, Lyndon Johnson said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost middle America. And to go back to the answer you gave a few minutes ago, where there was a great center during the 1970s, in order to have the ability to reach across the aisle, as Sarah wants, as we all want, you have to have some sort of bridge between one side and the other. And my question is, are there any bridges left? I mean, you had close relationships between people like Senator Kennedy, and Senator Hatch. They would work together. Jesse Helms worked with, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember his name, the senator from Minnesota who died in a plane accident, 1994. I can't remember his name. Thank you. You had those relationships that I think Sarah very much is alluding to, where you could have it coming together, or you had, Jake Javits of New York and some other Democrat back in the olden days. And I'll take Sarah's question one step further. Are we so governed by the dictates of what we see on basic cable that there is very little room to maneuver to the middle where compromise is considered a bad word?
Well, I would love to hear what some other people think, because I have nothing original to say here. It appears to me that both parties, it's the extremes of both parties that are driving things, and the middle is very, very narrow, and that the scope for bipartisanship is very small.
Right, I think Ben we can really add something to this based upon the field work he did on his last book. Yeah,
I think if anybody is capable of bipartisanship in this era, it's Biden, and that he's doing his best. But the Republicans have no interest in helping him. And Mitch McConnell is he did his best to sabotage Obama, and that's clearly his agenda for Biden. And even though they purportedly have a personal friendship, but as Jeffrey said, it's the extremes of both parties that's unfortunately driving the agenda now.
I mean, there was a time, to Ben's point, when Lyndon Johnson and Senator Dirksen could sit down over a river of Cutty Sark, figure out a way to get the Civil Rights Act of '64 through, the Voting Rights Act of '65 through, and the Open Housing Act of '68 through, and do it in a way that both people, both players weren't perceived as weak or losers on what would have been Fox or what would have been MSNBC back in that period. And there's also a sense that the middle has really been hollowed out. And the question is, I mean, I'll ask Steve Schlesinger that question. I think he could answer it as best as anybody else can. You want to take a crack at that one? And you're on mute, Steve. We can't hear you. I think you're on mute on your side. We still can't hear you. Let's see what we have here. Well, while Steve acts, gets back online with his voice. Who's up next? Because I've got a good question.
Bob, I asked another question. I sent it to you about China.
Okay, we'll go with that one as well. And before we get to Sarah's question, why was $35 an ounce seen as sacrosanct in political terms? Had, for example, as some argue, the price of gold would have been tied to a rate of inflation, would the valuation of gold at that point give a presidential administration enough running room to say that they would be able to handle all of their potential claims against American currency? And then we'll go to Sarah's question.
I also have a question.
Okay, Diana, that's good.
Well, $35 an ounce was actually set, I'm going to say, I think it was 1934, 1935.
Right.
It was Franklin Roosevelt who said it. And, you have to remember, Second World War, everything was suspended. There was no international commerce as such, unless it was smuggling, or ships among the Allies. So when they came to setting the terms of the new global monetary system, they started from where they started where they left off. And that became a real problem because the British pound was valued against the dollar. It was too strong. The dollar was also too strong, but it was okay with us for a while because we could import everything we could import from the Allies. It didn't matter to us. Our economy was so strong and the demand was so great. So there had to be some adjustments that were made in the link between currencies and gold. But the dollar was the one thing they couldn't change because that was like the sun around which the whole galaxy revolved. And that's why this meeting in August was so dramatic, because it was the first big change in the Bretton Woods system. And it was a really big one. So I don't know, maybe there would have been a system in which gold would have been constantly revalued, but the architects of the system, they felt they were dealt a certain hand, and the system had to be, it couldn't be too sophisticated. It had to be, comprehensible to everyone. So they went with a fairly simple notion of linking the dollar to gold.
Next is Diana, and then I'll read Sarah's question, and then we have Daniel Henderson.
Thank
Diana,
you.
you're up.
Thanks. My question is about dark money in our politics. Is there a path to our being able to repeal Citizens United and the impact that has had on our system?
Well, I pass this to Ben, but I don't see any path. I don't see any path to that. I mean, I wish I could conjure one up and say it's a 5% possibility, but I can't think of it. Dan, what do you think?
I'd say 0 chance, not even 5%.
And next we go to Daniel, and then we'll go to Sarah's question, which I'll ask. Daniel, you're up.
All right, so on more of a base level, can you talk more about what the US gains or loses by having the dollar as the consensus international currency?
It's a really good question. It's a basic question, but I think it's very important. So let me say what I think we lose is that if our currency wasn't the one that is overwhelmingly used for international trade, excuse me, and international investment and savings, we would be much less at the mercy of what the markets think around the world about the dollar. So, there is a kind of a daily referendum on the dollar, on what the dollar represents. And we have to go with that referendum. It's a reason why China is so reluctant to allow its currency to be a global currency, because they give up domestic control. So I would say that is one disadvantage. And some people would say that a second disadvantage is because the dollar is the global currency, it's in high demand. It causes the dollar to be overvalued more often than undervalued. And when it's overvalued, it hurts our sales abroad because it makes them more expensive. And it sucks in imports because the strong dollar makes imports less expensive. And therefore, a strong dollar causes trade deficits, causes unemployment, and we have no control over this situation. So that would be the argument why we would prefer to have just an ordinary currency.
That, let's see. Lisa,
No,
did you have a,
no,
did you have
I'm
a
just-
question, Lisa?
No, I was just thinking about the comments before about, bipartisanship in this current administration. And I just, how do you take some of these people even, seriously on any policy?
You mean like Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Yeah,
Your
for
comment was.
instance, yes.
I say appoint Pat Toomey ambassador to the Vatican. That would
There
cure
you
a lot
go.
of headaches.
But also too, what's interesting, and I want to open this one up to Ambassador Schwab as well, because Jeffrey, you said something interesting about the Chinese not perhaps eager to see their currency become an international standard, because then they would lose control internally. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, I mean, I would flip it slightly. The point I was making was that the Chinese have been sort of tiptoeing up. The Chinese have been looking at various angles to have a reserve currency, but they're trying to figure out how to be a reserve currency without the government giving up control over the renminbi. And the current system has required, at least generally, that the reserve currencies, the levels relative to each other are dictated by market forces. And we can have a discussion about different countries' monetary policies, but not the kind of government intervention that the Chinese government still wants to have, the kind of controls the Chinese government still wants to have over their currency. And if you are an investor, and if you're operating in currencies and you realize that at the whim of a Chinese government official could change the value of dramatically change the value of your holdings at any given point in time, the way, for example, all of the various coercive diplomacy actions have affected Australia or affected Canada or affected various brands, that creates some questions. Can I interject something here, though?
Please.
I probably, judging from the conversation, I'm probably the only Republican in this lunch conversation.
No, I count.
Well, then I'm probably the only Republican willing to
They've
speak
been
up.
tagged and released back into the wild, but yes, it's probably
Okay.
3-1 Democrat. But go ahead.
Okay, well, let me just, with respect to policies here, there's not a whole lot of light between Trump trade policies, trade policies, I would argue export control policies, trade sanction policies. A lot of the policies were deficit spending policies. So many of the financial and economic policies we're talking about right now, other than domestic spending, there's not a whole lot of light between the Trump policies and what we're seeing in the Biden administration. So, let's reflect here when we're talking about who's doing what to whom, because from my perspective, I mean, I look at the trade policies, they look exactly the same. Thank you very much. And you're looking at economic sanctions and you're looking at financial sanctions. They look exactly the same. In fact, those are holdovers from the Obama years. So, let us note that there's a lot of bipartisanship. It just may not be in a space that some of us are comfortable with.
Ambassador, how much is heat and how much is light?
It's real. I mean, just ask importers, ask manufacturers of upstream processed aluminum and steel goods. It's not like the Biden administration came in and lifted those trade barriers. They're still there. And it's not just trade barriers against the Chinese, it's trade barriers against the Europeans and trade barriers against the Japanese and trade barriers against a whole bunch of our allies and threats of new trade barriers against a lot of our allies. So no, it's kind of there.
Well, let me just say, you don't have to make this Republican versus Democrat. If we're talking about the dollar, at least what I was trying to say was sanctions, or the overuse of sanctions, is something that has been going on for a long time, and it works against confidence in the US and confidence in the
No,
dollar.
Jeff, I agree with you entirely, Jeff. The point I'm making is everyone who's talking about the absence of a center and bipartisan policymaking, the irony here is the policy perspective is almost identical on a lot of these policy issues between Republicans and Democrats. It's just some of us are uncomfortable with those policies, and I think Jeff has articulated that. But the actual policy stances are pretty darn close between the Trump administration policies and the Biden administration policies. There's not, well, anyway, I've made my point.
You made your point. I really appreciate it. And I will clarify, I have been told that we're roughly 60-40 Democrat to Republican. So it's a more even than it says. So I'm going to go back to Ben, because Ben's going to have to take off in a few minutes. And we got about 10 more minutes left in the call before we come to a conclusion. This has really been great. Ben, you're up.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask Jeffrey, we've seen this spike in inflation, and some economists have argued that this is temporary, tied to the problems with the supply chain post-COVID. How serious do you think this current inflation is, and how long lasting will it be?
Well, I don't know. But I think that there is I would say there's a good chance that it's not anywhere near as threatening as a lot of people are making it out. But having said that, let me go back to the comparison between 71 and now. In the early 70s, there was inflation. It was gathering force. And there was an enormous debate among the economists about what to do. And there was a feeling that if the so-called Phillips curve, if you slowed the economy, prices would come down. You'd have higher unemployment, and that's what Nixon was against. But not everybody believed that. In fact, Arthur Burns, who was the head of the Fed, said that you couldn't tame inflation with higher interest rates or with a more conservative budget. You had to control wages and prices, because the wages kept going up, prices kept going up. I mean, we had strong unions then, so there was all this collective bargaining. So the point I want to make is that all the experts diverged. And I'm seeing the same right now, that you have very, very credible economists on both sides of this. Some saying this is, we may have some inflation, but it's not at all pernicious, and it will level off as soon as the global economy comes back, and it will. And we're at the mercy of a couple of very key supply chain breakdowns. And then there are others who are basically saying, there are much bigger factors at play. The pressure, the downward pressure on prices from globalization is really beginning to end, because globalization is slowing down, especially globalization of trade in goods. And demography has changed. And so, old people like me have less reason to save than to spend. So we're going to put a lot of pressure on demand. I don't know who is right, but my guess is that the pandemic created such distortions in the global economy that we at least have to give it a chance to unwind. Having said all that, there is one other thing that is common between the early 70s and today, which is very worrisome. And that is, once you conclude that inflation is out of the bag, it's very hard to contain, short of what Paul Volcker did and throw the economy into a real recession. because it takes a while, the monetary policy only operates with a long lag. So Chairman Powell, who I have nothing but the highest respect for, is saying, if we see inflation, we will put on the brakes. And I'm saying, history shows if you see inflation, it's too late. But if you do it too early, there's a huge human cost. So I think anybody who says this is exactly the situation, I'd be very leery of that kind of certainty.
Okay, we got time for one question, which I'll ask it. I'll ask the question that nobody's asked. That goes to your wife's cooking.
Yes, my favorite subject.
There we go. And and it's been fun watching you come in and out of the shows. In fact, there's a book essentially which is Cooking for Jeffrey. But walk us through that experience. Where you are married to one of the most famous people in cooking. Walk us through that progression, if you could. And it's interesting because we've had some emails back and forth, and we've worked with a lot of your wife's cooking, and and once I get beyond some rookie errors, some bad, silly mistakes, it's a lot of fun. And so walk us through that, how she became who she is today.
Well, let me say, I met her when she was 15. And we got married when she was 20. And I think it's safe to say that she couldn't boil water when we got married. Had never, ever cooked anything. In fact, her mother prohibited her from going in the kitchen, thought she should be studying and not cooking. So of course, when we got married, that's all she wanted to do was cook. And I remember after a couple of months writing my mother saying, "Mom, you're just not going to believe what's coming out of this kitchen." And my mother was a horrible cook. And I just didn't know this, food like this existed. But she went, she worked 10 years in Washington and then decided that she didn't like the world of policy. She wanted something much more tangible. And we bought a little store that had been open only 6 months. And she built that store into an empire. And after 20 years in this specialty food store, gourmet store, she sold it to her employees and thought her life was over. She was about 50. And she decided to write a cookbook with the idea of never finishing it. But at least she was just embarrassed when people said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she had nothing, she wasn't doing anything. Anyway, she finished the first book. It was a massive bestseller. She's on her 13th book now, and has this very, very successful TV show. But the thing, I could talk about it for hours, but the thing that is really inspiring is that there were no mentors, there were no shortcuts. That I watched this thing grow and grow and watch her become more and more famous, increment by increment. It's on her talent is on such a solid base. There was no shooting star, there was no great break. It just happened organically. And I'll just give you one example, and then I'll shut up. But to this day, no recipe gets printed until it's tested 15 times. And it's tested not just by her, but by 3 assistants, each of whom is at a different level of skill. And she sits there and watches each. And one will do something really off the wall, and I'll say, "What in the world went through your mind?" And she'll correct the recipe so some amateur couldn't do it that way. And it goes up the scale. But this is, in a way, a science lab that is tested and tested and tested. So I think all of her fame is really is well deserved. You're talking about someone who's biased, but that's the story.
Well, all I can say is we love you both, and we absolutely love when she's cooking and she says, and Jeffrey's coming home for the weekend, or I'm making Jeffrey's favorite meal, or he really loves it. So thank you for sharing both your time and your wife with the broader global community. We've learned a lot today. I have. Thank you.
Well, this has been a great luncheon. This has been a great luncheon society, and it's now 10:30 in Copenhagen, and I'm gonna mosey on down to the bar in a few minutes here. I want to thank everybody for coming. It was a very interesting crowd today because we had about 36 people, all in all, 36, 37 people coming, but they kind of came in, came out, came in, came out, stayed. It was kind of cool. And Jeffrey, if you can hang on to the call for a second, I'll go over a few things. But I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's been a lot of fun. And this was just a great conversation. So thank you all very much. And Jeffrey, you can hold on for a second.
Thank you very much.
See you soon, Jeff.
Okay, look forward.
Take care.
Here we go. So I think Jeff, we did about 35 books today.
Oh, great.
So what I'll do is I'm going to send over the, when I get back on Saturday, assuming I can get in without any any issue, but that's changing by the day. There are a couple of Mike Dukakis wanted to come today. He couldn't. He had a family issue. Sends his regards. There were a few other folks, but this is a great discussion. We had some smart people around the table.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was.
And
really
the other
fun.
thing too is I want to make sure that you have a chance. I'll send Ben Bradley's contact information between the two of you so that you can enjoy. So, okay, we'll take it. Thank you very much.
Well, listen, I owe you a lot of thanks. It was a huge amount of work you put into this, and it was really very gratifying.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We do 350 of these since we started, so we're getting good at it. Take care and have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye now.
Safe travels.
You too.